Prepare your brief. Thelma wasn't exactly devastated, but she weighed in definitely somewhere between distraught and frantic. The hostess, her good friend, had called her and told her that she had placed Thelma beside the most important guest at the dinner, a nuclear physicist whose name, if not a household word, did appear in the columns of the New York Times whenever the Soviets imprisoned a colleague or some younger professor tried to revise Newton. Thelma was a wreck. She came to me wailing that she didn't know a thing about physics. I calmed her down and asked her if she ever froze whenever the waiter brought her a salad because she didn't know a thing about Brussels sprouts. Thelma indeed didn't know a thing about physics. The physicist, however, didn't know much about laymen scared to death about being expected to make conversation with a physicist. I advised her to swallow her reticence and look at the evening as sort of a summit meeting between the two. Why do you suppose, Professor, that your field intimidates people even more than, say, surgery or flying jets? Do most people you meet outside your field own up to that awe, or do they try to mask it? What kind of conversation makes you most comfortable when you're placed with someone who has no idea of what a physicist does day after day? Was there one outstanding experience in your childhood that made you want to become a physicist? What would you want to be if you weren't a physicist? How would you explain Einstein's theory to a typical 5th grade class? I once asked a magician if he ever saw a trick he couldn't figure out, and he told me he never did understand how Blackstone got the elephant on stage. Is there any formulation in physics today that you don't understand? Are we ahead of the Soviets in physics? Are there many opportunities for women in physics today? Are women any less logical than men when they're trying to unlock the secrets of the universe? What have you changed your mind about most since you first picked up a physics book? What's the biggest unsolved problem in physics? Are there any new weapons physicists talk about that we haven't read about yet? If you had an unlimited budget, what breakthrough could you achieve? Would you want your daughter to marry a physicist? I urged Thelma not to write any of those questions down, just to read them over and slip those she felt comfortable with into the conversation casually and earnestly. I told her to try to enjoy herself and not come across like an aspiring talk show hostess being auditioned before a producer who's already frowning. I instructed her as Napoleon's Talleyrand instructed his younger diplomats. Above all, not too much zeal. Thelma told me later it went supremely well. The physicist broke down and confessed he dreaded coming that night into what he thought would be another den of fawning laymen fumbling for ways to get a conversation going. He thought he would have to carry the water. Toscanini knew all about carrying the water. A wealthy matron once called the famous musician and asked what his fee would be to play at her garden party. My fee, Toscanini replied, is $10,000. That's outrageous, said the woman, and hung up. The next day she called back, a slight dent in her ego, and said, all right, I'll pay you your $10,000, but You're not allowed to mingle with the guests. Why didn't you tell me that yesterday, ma'am? Toscanini replied, in that case, my fee is only $5,000. The physicist knew how to unlock the forces of nature. Thelma knew how to unlock the forces of human nature. I'm going to meet a lot of people in the next 24 hours. How can I turn every single one of those contacts to my advantage? It takes some people a lifetime to admit that's a legitimate question. Many never make it. The soft side, I fear, has the head start. We're trained from childhood to look down on pushy people, selfish people, opportunists, social climbers, those who use others, and those who are interested in others only for how much they can get. Those despicable types aren't the only ones who feel it. They aren't the only ones who do it. They're just the only ones who show it. Imagine as you enter that room, everybody freezing, all conversation coming to a halt, and everybody going into deep meditation to determine precisely what he or she could do to make you happy. And snap back to the real world. Get in there and see how much of that potential you can harvest. Politicians know what it means to work the room. No elected official ever worked a room better than the late Senator Jacob Javits of New York. He was awesome. Javits understood the unwritten attribute of leadership that warns leaders to avoid the ostensible. For example, the worst thing a candidate can do at a cocktail party is have a cocktail. At coffee breaks, the leader neither breaks nor drinks coffee, and political dinners are not for eating, not for the candidate anyhow. They're for work in the room. Jake Javits could keep his body from the waist up, cocked at a 45-degree angle for an hour at a time without ever straightening up as he grasshoppered from table to table, person to person, greeting, chatting, chuckling, shaking hands, and maintaining a practiced stance of exuding affability while never faking acquaintanceship. If he really had no idea who that person was. We plain old people, citizens, and invited partygoers don't work rooms. Instead, we beeline toward those who we know and like, those who are or might become important to us, and those who arouse our flirt glands. And we make perfunctory and sometimes grudging conversation with all others as we're introduced. To us, however, most of those in that room remain other people at the party. Who are those other people at the party? Among them are most likely, if not undoubtedly, your potential employers or best friends, or potential employers, potential customers, clients, buyers of whatever it is you sell, potential supporters for whatever campaign or endeavor you might someday choose to mount, potential desirable hosts, potential desirable guests, potential good buddies who, if met, could make that party live forever, as the day I met so-and-so. That room full of people you instinctively regard as background people, no more important to you than background music or wallpaper, may contain precisely the clout and qualifications you need or could use or may need or may be able to use. They may be just the ones to marry you, enrich you, lift and color your life, or at least speak well of you whenever your name comes up. They will not bestir themselves to hoist your fortune in any of these capacities, however, if you let them remain as background people. Roast pheasants do not fly into mouths merely because they're hanging there open. So why don't you move out smartly and see how many allies you can enlist? not just by talking to them, but by talking to them in a manner calculated to make them talk. If ever candy begged to be taken from a baby, it's that sweet little motto of the Boy Scouts: be prepared. It doesn't move you, does it? Too bad. We've heard it so early and so often, it's lost its fizz. It was the first wisdom to limp to the elephant graveyards of our minds and become cliche 001. If, as a celebrated wit once observed, youth is too important to waste on children, then be prepared is too important to waste on Boy Scouts. Dredge it up, resurrect it, give it mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and let it lift your life. Most of us have a sensor in the brain that annihilates incoming facts that don't interest us. The hostess tells you who's going to be at the party, sometimes verbally and in writing. But that crisp, efficient, all-business mind of yours weeds that out. All you want to know is where and when, and some general idea of what pleasures to expect. The people, you'll take care of them when you get there. Pretend it's a board game. You may score the big life-lifting connection just by walking aimlessly down the street. The knights of the Round Table encountered damsels in distress aplenty, and young Horatio Alger kept impressing millionaires he happened to meet randomly. But don't you obviously stand a better chance of scoring those connections at a meeting, a luncheon, or with a group? Don't those chances soar at parties and large gatherings? I hope I never have to prove it, but I am prepared. In my Boy Scout handbook, it clearly stated we were to take deliberate note when we entered a theater or some other enclosed public space of the best exit to escape through if there were a fire. If there were a public panic, the handbook assured us you would panic too, but you would panic in the right direction. So, rule 1 of preparing your brief is dismantle your blocking system. Give your censor the day off when the hostess, the invitation, the mailgram, the press release, or any source of whatever is giving you information on who's going to be there. Listen, try to care. That may do the trick right there. If written, notice carefully the names of the honored guests and their affiliations. Embed them in your mind. What does that organization or firm they head or belong to mean to you? What might it mean to you? Be broad about it. Let your mind wander. If verbal, ask questions. Make sure you have a clear picture of who's who and who hunkers and where. As clear a picture as you can glean without getting caught on an inflamed curiosity rap. Now you're ready for rule 2. Do some basic research. Nobody expects you to demand an unabridged guest list in time for you to hire a college student to comb through who's who, to see who's there, and prepare abbreviated dossiers on all those you're likely to meet at the party. Nobody expects you to call your sorority sister, who now works for the FBI, to enlist her help in coming up with some good tidbits on those expected to attend the ball. That doesn't mean you have to operate under a blackout. There's usually someone connected with every party. Generally, the host or hostess, or an employee or social secretary or a friend of the host or hostess, who not only might be persuaded to tell you a little bit about some of the guests who are coming, but who quite literally can't be shut up on the subject. If you do nothing but pay attention for a change to what information is volunteered about the guess by those with an emotional vested interest in the success of the party, you will have done basic research. Anything that does not interest us tends to disinterest us deeply. Before I discovered the human fires that could be ignited by knowing certain things about the people I was meeting, I deliberately let precious information splash down the drain. I remember my annoyance and impatience with the hostess who called to invite me and gushed on in detail sufficient to numb the lower limbs about the incredible accomplishments and virtues of those with whom I was soon to share fellowship. I also remember later wanting to use those numb lower limbs of mine to kick myself aft for not having paid attention and taken notes, so I could have treated those people to the flattery of knowing, or at least spared them the insult of not knowing. What I don't remember is why it took me so many years to make the connection and start thirsting for raw material with which to weave. Not witty talk that might make them laugh, but meaningful conversation pertinent to them. We're all prisoners of those who ask us non-annoying, intelligent questions that evidence effort and concern for our interests, our works, and us. Richard Brookhiser, managing editor of National Review, begins his powerful book about the 1984 Reagan-Mondale campaign, The Outside Story, by recounting what an unnoticed teenager saw in 1960 on an almost empty deck of the Staten Island ferry. A bleary, weary Senator John F. Kennedy, surrounded by aides, stormed aboard. There was no time to rest. Those few minutes sailing across New York Harbor were needed to brief the candidate about the people on the other side, the Brooklyn politicos whose support was so crucial to the young senator's candidacy. His aides competed with each other to impress upon Kennedy's tired faculties a snapshot and a few facts about the people wanting to greet him. This one likes to be called Jimmy. That one owns a roller rink. This one's decided to run for city council. That one's wife just passed a civil service exam. I've departed from Brookhiser in the details, but never mind. We understand the power of a British monarch conferring knighthood upon a worthy subject. We can understand the power of the Dalai Lama singling out a Tibetan priest for inclusion into the Potala. Those who've never been close to frontline politics, however, may not be able to understand or even believe the power of a national candidate recognizing, knowing the name of, and even knowing something about one of his supporters waiting there on the shore of Brooklyn to greet him as he makes his triumphant landfall from Staten Island. You would understand it if you'd been there when Kennedy greeted the first four people with, "Hi there, Jimmy. I was looking forward to seeing you." "Al, who's watching the rink?" "Marv, I gotta tell you, I think it's great you're going to run for the city council." And "Vito, I can't tell you how relieved I am now that Mildred's passed that exam." Listen to some party talk. Analyze it. It may be jovial. It may be rich. A lot of it may even be worth quoting, but underneath it all is the message. It usually says, "Look, I don't care about you, you don't care about me, so what's the big deal? Let's have a drink." I have a friend, Bob Elliott, who's an executive of a media consulting firm whose clients include over 300 of the Fortune 500 companies. The instant he sees me, his face takes on an expression that seems to say, "At last now, I can get the information I've been craving on how my friend Barry is getting along. He then asked me for a brief report on how all my various projects and enthusiasms are faring. He doesn't do it in a challenging way that gives the choice of lying or admitting failure in the case of a project that isn't doing too well. He invites me to testify about whichever of my projects I enjoy discussing, each time precisely where I left off the time before. Does my friend do it like John F. Kennedy was caught doing it on the Staten Island ferry? Does he review my particulars on 3x5-inch cards when his date book tells him we're likely to be in proximity? Does he want something from me? If so, he's got it. Magicians don't admire other magicians only when they pull off absolute black magic. A well-executed trick will do. Bob executes his trick supremely well. Is he an opportunist? I certainly hope so. It would be a waste of good talent if he weren't. What is the opposite of opportunist, anyhow? Is it opportunity avoider? Rule 3. Pick berries. Whatever you have as preparation when you arrive at the party is your prepared lunch. Be sure to go berry picking once you're there. People will tell you things about other people present for those not consciously out to enlarge and strengthen their network of active allies. Such information might be over-the-counter sleeping potion. Not for you. Drink it in. Does the accountant you're talking to lean closer to you and report admiringly the tall, well-dressed man who just brushed by with a smile and a hello was a trees distributor 4 years ago whose teenage son taught him to tinker with a home computer, and between the two of them they worked out a program that increased sales and simplified deliveries, and they just sold the whole package to General Foods for $4.5 million. Our instinct, whether inspired by jealousy, apathy, or awe, is to say really and let it go. You can blast a hole in the Great Wall of China with less dynamite than that. Modest dogs miss much meat. Seek that man out and come on to him with something like, "Excuse me for interrupting. Let me introduce myself. I just heard that marvelous story about you and your son. Tell me, if a gypsy had told you 5 years ago that you'd make a fortune in the software business, would you have paid him his $2? He'll talk, believe me, he'll talk. And if you ever need him for a reasonable favor, he'll listen." Rule 4. Do homework. You don't have to do much homework. In fact, the kind of homework that would have earned you nothing better than an F in college could earn you a huge win in the real world. A simple, superficial scan job before you enter the fray will make you the best prepared person at the party, except for those in the field, profession, industry, or endeavor you just scanned, and they don't count. If a group of Chinese are speaking Chinese and another Chinese comes over and joins the conversation in Chinese, that's no headline. If, however, an American comes over and starts speaking Chinese, that's big news. If you're from outside the industry, the field, the purview of those you're talking to, and have some knowledge of that area nonetheless, congratulations, you're speaking Chinese. The party, let's say, is convened to celebrate a professor whose work in hydroponic farming was just honored by the government of Malta. Don't go crazy, don't cancel plans, order books, comb through the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature for relevant articles, and hire a consultant recently retired from the State Agricultural Commission. Read what's handy. If an article on hydroponic farming happens to be in the newspaper, you're about to throw away, that's a nice coincidence, but far from supernatural. A Persian proverb tells us good fortune favors the industrious. Do you recall an article on that or some similar topic in one of the papers or news magazines you haven't thrown away yet? Go pro-labbing for it. By the way, even though you're not a public library, a data bank, or a network newsroom, there's nothing wrong with keeping your own informal clip service. Clip articles that seem to provide handy payloads of information in easy to grasp, interesting language on subjects that might come across your windshield later on. Mark the highlights with yellow felt pen and file them alphabetically in one of those inexpensive accordion files for tax papers they sell in dime stores. Devastatingly effective. Hydroponic is merely the bull's eye here. You get a lot of points if your dart lodges in one of the outer concentric circles too. For example, Israeli drip irrigation, drought, world hunger, new fertilizers, soybean futures, stock trends in agribusiness, wheat storage, the effect of radiation leaks on Brussels sprouts, or techniques of farm reposition by Iowa marshals. Any little scrap of knowledge on any of these or many other related and vaguely related subjects gives you the power to trigger some good talk with those present. With even your scrap of knowledge, they'll perceive you as talking like one of us, rather than like a civilian smiling lamely when introduced to the hydroponics professor and saying, "That sounds interesting." In what other university except the real world do you get A's and honors with nothing but a little scrap of knowledge? Rule 5. The latest news. Don't leave home without it. It's bullying and annoying to have friends and associates ask you before 10 in the morning if you read a certain piece in that morning's paper, especially when they ask in that challenging tone of voice that leaks the fumes of "I've got you now." Being current is an important quality. "Gee, I haven't seen a paper in days," relegates you to the same netherworld as "I'm no good until I've had my coffee." And thank God it's Friday. Not hanging crimes, mind you, just crimes. Being prepared for winning conversations demands you no more leave home without the latest news than without shave, coiffure, cash, or credit card. Being up on the latest books, movies, plays, restaurants, discos, exhibitions, the reviews of all of the above is nice, just nice, that's all. That kind of homework can betray a kind of insecurity, an anxiety-riddled deliberation if trafficked in conversation the least little bit awkwardly. Being up on the latest news, however, is essential. I have only twice in my life gone into my day unbriefed by the latest news. One late spring morning toward the latter part of World War II, I overslept. I was a boy eager to make good in his very first school vacation job, and I didn't want to get my employer, Mr. Davidson, down at the auto supply shop angry by coming in late. On the way downtown on the bus, I spotted our good friend Chester Brown walking to his car carrying a radio. I figured it was broken and he was taking it in for repair. Then I saw Mr. Shelley, the stockbroker, also carrying a radio. Were radio breakdowns epidemic? When I got to work, Mr. Davidson didn't scold me for not knowing General Eisenhower's troops had invaded Normandy earlier that morning. He just assumed I was as apathetic as any other boy who was looking forward to a career assembling battery cables for the wholesale distributor. Even at that age, I was too proud to beg Mr. Davidson to believe me that that was the only morning since babyhood that I left home unbriefed, and that I was really a with it kind of guy who knew and cared about things like wars and invasions. I bit my lip and swallowed my lesson. I didn't do anything that gross and disqualifying until July 4th, 1976. A Manhattan apartment faced the Hudson River at 86th Street, the best vantage point from which to watch the tall ships as they paraded past. It was Op Sale Day, the pinnacle celebration of the bicentennial, and I had two huge terraces on the 20th floor with an unobstructed view. My apartment is where Mussolini would have watched his Navy parade if the war had worked out differently. I had invited 700 people to a rooftop party. This called for somewhat more food and drink allocation than usual, so I abandoned my normal day plan, which included careful attention to the headlines. I managed to hear only 9 words of news before the guests arrived. They were: the hostages cheered when they saw the Israeli soldiers. As I smashed open crates of cheese and sausages that morning, I thought about that sliver of news. It was great. Obviously, there had been some kind of break in the Entebbe hijacking and hostage crisis. Secret negotiations must have been going on for days between Israel, Uganda, and whoever seized and was holding the hostages. They must have agreed on a deal for their release. Part of the deal must have been for Israeli soldiers in uniform to fly to Entebbe to receive the hostages as they were released. Good old Israel, thought. Strong and shrewd they are to insist on the right to show their flag and their force as part of the settlement. Other countries would have wimpishly let the Swiss Red Cross do it. I was proud I managed to infer so much of the story from so few words of news. Too many hundreds of hot dogs needed thawing for me to dwell upon it. One of the first guests to arrive was press attaché of the Israeli consulate, Azariah Rappaport, who jubilantly asked if I'd heard the news. Yes, I assured him. I certainly did. We can all be glad that's over. I'd give quite a nice sum to have a tape of the rest of that conversation between me and Azariah. He knew the story of the dramatic commando rescue at Entebbe, and I was under the delusion that they'd been freed because of some quiet negotiation in some embassy somewhere. Our enthusiasm levels didn't match. We were missing each other. Our dialogue was like turn-of-the-century drawing room farce. When Gabe Pressman and the Channel 4 TV crew arrived to tape news interviews with Azariah and some of the other guests, it began to dawn upon me. By nightfall, I, of course, knew and had actually begun to believe the facts of Israel's rescue at Entebbe. I'm not yet beginning to believe that after being caught not knowing about D-Day on June 6, 1944, I could let them catch another pass behind my back in the same lifetime. Even if you can't stop your forward momentum, can't sink into a newscast, and can't peruse the morning papers and the weekly news journals during commercials, there's a way to defend yourself that takes no longer than 15 seconds. Just watch or listen to the first 15 seconds of any TV or radio newscast. It won't tell you about a library extension dispute in the city council, go to a commercial, cover a parade, and offer Jiffy recipes, and then tell you about a Soviet amphibious invasion of Denmark. The Denmark item will be first. So if you can't take time to find out what's happened, at least take 15 to find out what hasn't happened. If they start out by talking about libraries and parades or even congressional quarrels and indictments, you know well within 15 seconds that the map of the world and the state of the world are pretty much the way you left them. And thank God there's been no war, assassination, plane crash, or crowded commuter train plunging off a trestle into a turbulent, flood-swollen river. Offensive listening is preferred. Defensive listening is essential. Comic, henny young men taught that concept in much less time than it takes to read this chapter. The matron, gushy and giddy, seemed confused by a reference in the conversation to World War II. World War II, said Henny pointedly. You've heard of World War II. It was in all the papers.